lot about them. Our politicians rail a lot about them. Criminal defendants are often morally, spiritually, economically, educationally, and emotionally dead. And we lawyers have the opportunity to minimize their exposure and through love and direction, resurrect their lives. We won't always be successful. No one's always successful. Some people don't want to be redeemed, and that's the truth. But we can try. The Bible teaches that punishment is not for revenge, but to reduce crime and reform the criminal, a concept our country now ignores. In the book of James, let me repeat that to you all too. The Bible teaches that punishment is not for revenge, but to reduce crime and reform the criminal. This is a concept that our state and our federal government now ignores. In the book of James, Jesus says, my brothers, if you live today, say my brothers and sisters, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let them know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. It is with this hope that I work, and all of us should work, not the pious hypocrisy to blame and judge. And finally, in Matthew, the famous saying, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those that mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. These are teachings that moved me to the practice of criminal law. To me, my neighbors are not just lawyers. They're not just doctors or businessmen. They don't belong to the country club necessarily. They're not politicians and teachers. Sure, those are the people I live with. But my neighbors are also the convicted, the accused, the poor, the disenfranchised, the hopeless, the unemployed, and the unemployable. They are so often people who I see as clients. And lastly, a criminal lawyer fights power. And power, especially political power, is, I submit to you all, more often evil than it is good. No matter how it professes its piety. There was a 60-minute show not long ago that some of you may have seen where a prosecutor admitted his role in putting an innocent man on death row. His confession was beautiful and honest and sad. Another prosecutor who had been appointed to the case because of this prosecutor's admission grudgingly released the man, but washed his hands like Pontius Pilate of any social or human responsibility for the detritus created by the unfairness that exists in our criminal law system, saying that he was not in the compassion business and criminal defense lawyers shouldn't be in the compassion business either. Truthfully, too often prosecutors wash their hands of humanness, compassion, and responsibility. And I know there are prosecutors in here tonight. And too often defense lawyers do not accept their duty. But this prosecutor in this show, who has more people on death row than any other, he is our nation's Joe Freeman Britt, is just wrong about compassion. If we are Christians, or if we are just humans, we must be in the compassion business. As an aside, when I die, I was telling Jamie, the first thing I want to do is go find St. Peter's office. I want to volunteer to prosecute judges, prosecutors, lawyers who don't care about their clients, who think and believe that they ought to get into heaven. It is my belief today, and I'll give you some statistics in a moment, that our criminal system is not just. And I believe it violates Christian teachings in almost every way. We are the world's self-proclaimed greatest democracy. We are labeled by many politicians as a Christian nation. Yet in the United States of America, we have 4.56% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. How many of you knew that? Who aren't lawyers? None. I want you to think about that statistic. 25% of the world's prisoners are here. We exceed China, Russia, all the totalitarian countries in percentage by 15 to 20% of the number of prisoners as it relates to our population. We have 2.2 million people in our prisons and jails. Over the last years, a 500% increase in prisoners. An additional 4.75 million Americans are presently subject to probation or parole. How many of you believe that the crime rates in the United States have steadily declined? How many of you believe that? Some of you. Crime rates in the United States have declined for 24 straight years in the face of this prison population explosion. Even though violent crimes have decreased steadily for 20 years, 1 in every 9 persons in prison is serving a life sentence. And most of these are the least of us. 40% of our prisoners, 40% of our prisoners are African American males. 1 in 9 African American males between the age of 20 and 34 years of age is now in prison. And if present rates hold, 1/3 of black males will have served active time in their lifetimes. And this is what we don't understand. Finally, people like the Koch brothers are starting to speak from the other side. Because we don't understand that with all of this active time, all of these felonies that we have created and forced upon our citizens, comes disenfranchisement, unemployability, and recidivism, because they have no hope and nowhere to go. Further, 20% of our prison population is Hispanic. We have taken humanness out of sentencing. Compassion is impossible as we apply our Orwellian mathematical grid to punish humans without interest in reason, forgiveness, compassion, or rehabilitation. And no one cares about the future human consequence. Until now, when finally people are beginning to realize it. We have to understand, the ones of us that are in a hall like this, that poor people today in America have little hope. They're uneducated, they're unemployable, and they're disenfranchised. But we expect of them what we expect of the middle class or the privileged. When they sell drugs to support themselves, because there are no jobs for them to have, we incarcerate them all at higher and higher levels. In chapter 22 of Jeremiah, verses 15 through 16 says, "Do you think you're king because you go to worship? Did not your father eat and drink and do justice and righteousness? Then it was well with him. He judged the causes of the poor and the needy. Then it was well. Is not this to know me, declares the Lord?" In other words, if one really wants to know God, the only thing needed is to know justice and fairness and dignity and equality. I do not choose to engage in the selfish and cruel imprisonment of generations of Americans. I live in prisons. I'm in prisons almost every day. I know the people in prisons. I know their soul. I know who they are. I know them inside. I don't know them when they're in the back of a car or when they're standing in front of a mean judge who doesn't care. I don't always see them, although I do more than I would like sometimes in the squalid homes that they live in. The babies without mothers because their daddies are in prison. The inability to get an education because there's not electricity in your house, or there are 3 children who are screaming and yelling while you're trying to do your homework without a parent who understands what you're learning to help you. I don't know those things. I didn't come from that world. but I live in that world. I represented James Hutchins. James Hutchins was the first man to be executed in North Carolina when the death penalty came back in. James was a terrible drunk. He shot and killed 2 police officers in a fit of rage when they were trying to serve a warrant on him. He sat in prison for, I think, 27 years. I never knew James when he was drunk. I never knew James when he was violent. I saw an old Christian man, and he really was a Christian. They were going to execute him that night, and I went to say goodbye to him, and he said to me, "Somebody needs to watch me die. Who cares? So I have nobody but you." Well, I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't prepared for that. As he walked into the ready room, he handed me a little piece of paper. And he said, "Read this. This is the way I think of you, Mr. Cheshire." I opened that little piece of paper after he died. It had Micah 6, verse 8 written on it. So I went and got my little Bible. I looked it up, and it says, "He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" I have that little Bible right there in my desk every day that I look at. As I see Jesus' teachings, they are challenging and they are humbling. When I get discouraged, and my wife knows I get discouraged, at the sadness I see in my clients and their families, the sadness of their victims, when I see the callousness of the justice system with its piousness, and the false righteousness of many of those who sit and pass judgment, of the hardy hypocrisy of the politicians who pass our laws, when it seems that God has given me more than I can do, it helps to remember Jesus' words to the disciples. For human beings, it's impossible. But for God, all things are possible. It renews my hope, my reason for being a criminal defense lawyer, as well as my pride in being a Christian who tries as hard as he can to care more about people, not just those that look like me, than money and power. I speak to you all tonight from the heart. I'm so proud to be here and happy to be here. I hope that I have given you some sense. People that do what I do for a living are quite often disdained and reviled, and we're certainly misunderstood. There's nothing worse than a bad criminal defense lawyer, in my view. Worst it can be is an uncaring, bad criminal defense lawyer. The next time you hear bad things about us, just think that there are those of us out there that are trying to do good, uplift. And I'd also like for you all, no matter what your political persuasion is, to look and think about these statistics. We will die as a nation if we keep putting this many people in prison. If we forget that forgiveness and redemption work. If we forget that love heals everything, we are going to die as a nation. If we scream at each other all day long and don't listen, if we don't strive to understand what it's like to be poor and black, or poor and Mexican, or just poor, then we have lost our way as Americans. And we can't pretend that we are really Christians if we lose our way as Americans. And if we don't strive to understand and forgive. It's so easy. It's such a wonderful feeling to hug someone that needs forgiveness and love and to uplift them. It's a joyous, wonderful thing. So the next time someone says something about criminal defense lawyers really do remember that most of us do this for that reason. We don't get rich, believe me. Very few of us that do. It's been a great pleasure for me to be here with my wife and my great friend Mitchell Lada, who lives in your county, and to speak in front of you all. It's been a real privilege and a real pleasure. I told Carolyn we'll have to ride up the road. We live just first driveway on the right when you go under the 98 overpass on your way to the big city. We're probably closer to you all than downtown Raleigh, so maybe we'll come up and share a service with you sometime.